Is there a kind of a Canadian irony, or if you could classify it there, that you put your fingers on?
Well, everybody says it's self-deprecating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there certainly are enough examples that that's true. But what I found when I was studying Canadian, I started this by looking at a corpus of Canadian writing. Canadian poetry in particular, because I wanted to look at shorter units rather than larger structural ironies that you would find in novels. And I wanted to look at Canadian painting and photography as well. So from that corpus, contemporary, from a wide range of artists in terms of gender, sexual orientation, race, as much as I could, I found an entire range of ironies, not just one kind. Everything from the simply rhetorical use of irony to the playful, lots of playful ironies, to the self-deprecating. I have to admit there were a lot of examples of self-deprecating ironies. To the more negative self-protective ironies, to distancing ironies, to ironies that get really more negative, that were used evasively perhaps. Some were clearly put-downs, elitist ironies. Some were very oppositional, sometimes with satiric intent to correct vices or follies, as the definition goes. Other times just to attack, or to be defensive. There are defensive and offensive kinds of irony. I found all examples of all of these, and there are probably lots more. So I'm not sure I found one kind.
That dominates that characteristic of Canadian. And have you looked at the American ironies at all?
Not yet. That's still to come. Because I suspect it's different. Most people who write on Canadian irony, and there aren't that many, do suggest that where Canadians figure themselves as the iron figure, which in the Greek distinction, there's an iron and an alazon, and the iron is a self-deprecating, modest, it's Socrates, but it's the other side of that, the alazon, the braggart, gets sort of taken down by the iron. Well, the Americans usually tend to get cast by Canadians as the boaster figure, whereas the Canadian is the self-deprecating one. I think there's a certain national mythology going on there that may not be, in fact, proved by looking at the material. But I haven't looked at the American yet.
I guess we use a different line, but just your thoughts on it. We were talking together to the biologist, Peter, as an Italian. Started his work as a biologist, and from there moved into some cultural studies of perception, all kinds of things. But his influence was with a guy in Canada, Galbo College. And the question of me to relate to Canada is, I just thought it was somewhat amazing, actually, that his conversion is influenced by Canadian. And we have marginal.
Only Canadians think like that.
Do you think there's any, there's certainly a lot of thought given kind of cultural studies and leadership. Is there a reason for that?
The usual answer given is that because we had people like Innocent and McLuhan, their interest in communications, because this was such an enormous country, and communication was the basis of Canada, that it was, we had to build a railway before we could do anything. That communication and the problems of communication are built into the very fabric of Canadian history. And there is something to that, perhaps. I think we've just perhaps been very lucky in having some very important thinkers, what we used to call seminal thinkers, until the problems with that word were pointed out to us. In the area of communications, which becomes cultural studies, and in literature, Northrop Frye had that impact in a very different way, because it was a very formalist model, but it had social consequences. And I think that interest in cultural social relations is part of Canada's intellectual heritage. I think it's an interesting point.
And you came out of that sort of intellectual environment as well?
I did to some extent, except that I was raised intellectually in my undergraduate years, certainly as a standard liberal humanist. I really believed I was studying the eternal and the universal in art, and it was really only with graduate studies, part of which were done in the States and in Italy, where I discovered structuralism and cultural studies generally, that I came to question that, and from there to work in literary theory and in theories of culture, and subsequently in modes of subversion like irony and parody.